Hello students, welcome to lecture 4.3, African Americans, the Great Depression and the New Deal. In this lecture, we will focus on the Great Depression and its effects on the African American people. So we will start with a review of the causes and the consequences of the Great Depression. Then we will talk about the approach adopted by the president of that time, that was Herbert Hoover. Next, we'll talk about what the African American leaders were doing during the Great Depression. And we also talk about the approach by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So that's the next president after Hoover. Furthermore, we will talk about the interactions between President Roosevelt and the African American leaders. So we will focus on the Black Cabinet, the shift of the African American allegiance from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party as a result of the work of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And at the end of this lecture, we will talk about the Communist Party and the African Americans and the misuse of medical science over African Americans, and that was the Tuskegee study. So what was the Great Depression and what were the causes and consequences? The Great Depression, you may have heard from other people, was an economic downturn, which means that the economy went down, and that started in 1929 and lasted until 1939. So it was about 10 years that you have this economic downturn. So what was the cause? The major cause, according to many people, was the stock market crash in October 1929. So the stock market itself crashed because of different factors, and especially because of the speculation of people who are working in Wall Street. So the Wall Street, that's a place where people are buying and selling stocks. So because of the speculation, some of the stocks, the price of the stocks went really, really high and didn't really correspond to the value of the stock. So people try to get their money out of the system, and this led to a panic when people try to get their money out of the system. That led to a panic that led in turn to the crash of the system. So that's what happened. Now let's talk about the consequences of the Great Depression, and especially its consequences to African Americans. So the major consequence, like I said earlier, was the bankruptcy of banks and factories. So people lost their job. People who are working in those factories, in those banks, they were laid off by millions. With regard to African Americans specifically, it was the African Americans who really suffer from the Great Depression, because they are the first to be fired and the last to be hired. According to statistics, up to 80% of African American workers lost their job during the Great Depression. So what did the government do to deal with the Great Depression? The American president at that time, at the beginning of the Great Depression, was President Herbert Hoover, and he was a Republican. you may notice that the Republicans really don't believe in government handout. So that is really their ideology. The Republicans believe in personal responsibility and think that the government is the problem, not the solution. So because of that ideology, President Hoover relinquished, he really refused to give help to the workers from the federal government. But instead, he encouraged charitable organizations like the Salvation Army and other organizations to provide help, provide relief to the people who lost their job. But since the Great Depression is a huge problem affecting millions of Americans, this charitable organization just failed to meet the needs of these millions of people who lost their job and who were, most of them, on the street homeless. So the other approach by President Hoover was to help the business. So he gave loans to banks and companies, as well as giving loans to state and local government so that the economy could restart. So that is a familiar solution also from the federal government. That is called the bailout. So what did the African American leaders do during the Great Depression? The NAACP especially, which was led by Charles Houston and Thurgood Marshall, they campaigned against educational discrimination and political disfranchisement, which means they didn't really care about the economy. But they criticized the American political system as responsible for the Great Depression. So this approach led to a disagreement within the NAACP and prompted Du Bois to leave the organization, because Du Bois thinks that the NAACP focused too much on political rights instead of focusing on the economic problem that affect millions of African Americans. So that is a disagreement between Du Bois and the NAACP. As you may have also heard from previous history classes and your parents, the man who was able to solve the major problems of the Great Depression was President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. And this is the reason why he was elected 4 times as the President of the United States, and he was the only president elected that many times. So contrary to Herbert Hoover, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a Democrat from New York and elected in 1932, contrary to Hoover, FDR's approach was the New Deal. And the New Deal is a package programs, package of programs. So we have different programs put together, and that include public work projects, financial reforms, and different regulations enacted between 1933 until 1939. So that is a New Deal. You have here different programs and different laws that was passed by Congress. So with regard to African Americans specifically, FDR and his wife Eleanor Roosevelt were very attentive. They pay attention to the needs of the African Americans. And some of the New Deal program helped directly African Americans. and that was the case of the Work Program Administration, the WPA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, and in addition to that, FDR also created a black cabinet. So this is a group of people who advise him, a group of African Americans who advise him on African Americans' issues or problems. So these are the things that FDR did for the whole American people and for African Americans in particular. And this made him very popular president. So as you can see on this picture, we have the members of FDR's Black Cabinet in 1939. And you may recognize in the middle of the front row a lady, and that was Mary McLeod Bethune, one of the most important members of the Black Cabinet. As a result of the work of FDR and his wife, the great majority of African Americans switched their allegiance from the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, who abolished slavery, to the Democratic Party, and that is the party of Roosevelt. So they switched party because FDR was more helpful than the Republican at that time. So this allegiance, also this party switch, happened despite the racial discrimination from the Southern white Democrats. We already talked a lot about these Southern white Democrats, who were the most racist among white Americans. But there was also another party that was interested and tried to attract African Americans, and that was the Communist Party. Through the 1930s, the Communist Party supported African Americans' fight against racial discrimination and for social justice. The Communist Party even was involved in the case against the Scottsboro boys. So this is a case of young men who were accused of rape, and the Communist Party tried to help these boys. And the party also expelled members who were racist and gave black men a key leadership role in the party. But the Communist Party was banned in the United States during and after World War II. And this is because of a Cold War that existed between the United States and the Soviet Union. And people who were alleged to be a member of a Communist Party were harassed by the government, or some of them were even arrested. And this was also the reason why Du Bois left this country and went to live in Ghana in Africa for the rest of his life. Finally, a major scandal that was going on during the Great Depression was the so-called Tuskegee study. So this is a case of misuse of medical science toward African Americans. In this so-called study, there were white medical doctors who were experimenting really the development of syphilis on African American men, and this happened in the county of Macon in Alabama in 1932. So these white medical doctors were they were observing this male sharecropper who were having syphilis, and they just look at the development of this sickness, and they didn't even they didn't really treat the sickness. So in 1972, some people discovered this scandal, and it was all over the news. But it was only in 1992 that the people who survived this experiment, were recognized by the government, and they were compensated for their suffering. So you can see on this picture a group of African American men who were the subject of a Tuskegee experiment. So they were, like I said earlier, they were just observed by white medical doctors to see the development of syphilis among them, and this medical doctor did not treat their sickness. So that concludes this lecture on African Americans and the Great Depression. Please complete the reading and move to lecture 4.4 to continue.